The dining room of Aurelius smelled like money, old money. The kind that didn't need to announce itself because the silence did it for them. Zoey Winthrop had learned to read that silence in the 3 years she'd worked the floor. She could tell within 30 seconds of a table being seated exactly how the night would go. The way a man placed his phone, screen up, meant he was expecting someone to call him back about something important. Screen down meant he already owned the room and didn't need to check. The way a woman reached for her water glass, fingertips only, barely touching, like even the crystal was beneath her, told Zoey everything about how she'd be spoken to before the appetizers arrived. Table 9 that Thursday evening announced itself, before the party even sat down. There were 4 of them, 2 men in charcoal suits, so precisely tailored. They looked like architecture. 1 woman in a sheath, dressed the color of champagne, and a 4th man who arrived half a step ahead of the others. Not because he was leading them anywhere, but because space simply opened for him the way it tends to do for people who've never once in their adult lives had to wait. His name, Zoey would learn from the reservation, was Clifton Bauer, 47, founder of 3 companies, board member of 2 others, most recently profiled in the Times under the headline, "The Man Who Bought the Future." He had the jaw of someone who'd been told his entire life that his opinions were interesting. He took the chair at the head of the table, without asking, adjusted it a half-inch to the left with the heel of his hand, and surveyed the restaurant the way a general surveys a valley he's already decided to take. Zoey approached with menus. "Good evening. My name is Zoey, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with still or sparkling water?" Clifton Bauer did not look at her. He was already mid-sentence to the man across from him, something about quarterly projections and a competitor who was, in his precise words, intellectually overmatched and too arrogant to know it. His companion laughed. The woman in the champagne dress offered a smile that was not quite a smile, the practiced expression of someone who had learned to perform enthusiasm in the vicinity of powerful men. "Sparkling," the second man said. At least he made eye contact. His name card, which he set on the table with the ease of someone accustomed to formal dinners, read Marcus. Though this was no name from any list Zoey carried in her head, it was simply what the card said, and what the card said was all she needed to know about who mattered at this table and who did not. She brought the water. She brought the bread. She recited the evening specials with the quiet precision she'd cultivated over hundreds of dinner services. The pan-roasted halibut, the 45-day dry-aged ribeye, the truffle risotto that Chef Aldano had spent 6 months perfecting, and that Clifton Bauer interrupted halfway through her description of it to order the ribeye and a bottle of the 2011 Opus 1 without asking what anyone else wanted. The others ordered after him. Zoey wrote everything down. She smiled. In the kitchen, she set the ticket on the wheel and stood for exactly 4 seconds with her back to the pass-through, her eyes closed, recalibrating. She did this sometimes, 4 seconds. Long enough to remember that she was not the worst thing in the room, even when she was being made to feel like it. The night she'd gotten the call about her mother, 18 months ago now, though it felt like a different century. She had been studying for her qualifying exams in the graduate linguistics department at Columbia. 3rd year. She had passed her first 2 years on full scholarship, and her thesis proposal on the persistence of classical rhetorical structures in contemporary American political speech had been described by her advisor as the most original work this department has seen in a decade. She had been going to be something. She had been something already in the quiet way that takes a long time to show itself to the world. Then the call. Her mother's diagnosis, the specialist appointments, The numbers which did not add up in any arrangement Zoey tried. She'd taken a leave of absence that was supposed to be 1 semester, and had, through a series of incremental catastrophes, become indefinite. She'd taken the job at Aurelius because the tips were enough to cover the pharmacy bills and the rent on the apartment she now shared with her mother in Morningside Heights, Answ Heath, and because the hours didn't overlap with the morning shifts when her mother needed her most. She was 31 years old. She had read every major text in classical rhetoric in 3 languages. She wore a black apron and carried a wine key on her hip. None of this, she had decided, was anyone's business. She brought Table 9 their first course and refilled the Opus 1 with a practiced hand. Clifton Bauer was explaining to the table, his world, why the service industry attracted a particular type of person. Not his words exactly. He was more careful than that in company. She would discover. He preferred implication, the architecture of condescension without the fingerprints. There's a certain ceiling, he was saying. Cognitive, motivational. Some people hit it early and simply settle into wherever they land. He gestured vaguely at the breadth of the restaurant, which could have meant the decor, or the other diners, or the people who served them. No judgment, just observation. The world needs people who find satisfaction in the immediate and the tactile. His companion Marcus laughed again. The woman in the champagne dress took a sip of wine with the careful neutrality of someone choosing not to agree too loudly. Zoey refilled a water glass that didn't need refilling and said nothing. The entrees arrived. She coordinated the timing with the back server, a quiet man named Phil, who'd been at Aurelius for 11 years, and who had, over the course of those 11 years, apparently decided to keep every thought he'd ever had entirely to himself. They placed the plates in one synchronized motion. She announced each dish. She moved to leave. "Excuse me." She turned back. It was Clifton Bauer, and he was looking at her now. Really looking for the first time all evening. There was something clinical in it. The way he looked at her was the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they're deciding isn't quite right for the space. "The risotto," he said. She looked at the table. None of them had ordered risotto. "I'm sorry." The woman at the table behind me. "Her risotto." He indicated with 2 fingers. "Don't look, just know. She received hers before I received my entree. I've been watching the window." Zoey did not point out that the woman behind him had ordered the risotto as her main, and had therefore, naturally, received it when mains were served, which was precisely whence Clifton Bauer had also received his main. She did not say that the timing had been flawless, that Phil had pulled the tickets in the exact sequence they'd come in, that there was no lapse, no error, no failure of any kind. "I apologize for any confusion," she said. "Is there anything I can get for you?" He held her gaze for 1 beat too long. "Just making sure someone's paying attention." She smiled. She left. In the service corridor behind the kitchen, she pressed her palm flat against the cold steel wall and breathed once, slowly. Then she straightened, tucked her order pad into her apron, and went to check on table 7. The dinner stretched. Clifton Bauer ordered a second bottle of wine that he then criticized for being slightly past its window, which was not true. She knew the vintage, had pulled it herself, it was exactly right, and sent back a cut of meat that appeared to have 1 thin strip of fat along its edge, which he described to her with the patient condescension of someone explaining a very simple concept to a very slow student as unacceptable for what we're paying. She replaced it without comment. The kitchen was not happy. She absorbed the friction between the 2 rooms and carried on. It was near the end of the main course. The table had relaxed into the particular looseness of 3 glasses of good wine, when Clifton Bauer said something to his companions in a voice just slightly louder than the ambient murmur of the room. probably because 3 glasses of good wine had recalibrated his sense of volume. Ancilla mensa non intelligit. The woman in the champagne dress glanced up sharply. Marcus went very still for a fraction of a second, then looked down at his plate. The other man, the quiet fourth, who had barely spoken all evening, said nothing, but something shifted in his face. Clifton Bauer smiled. Satisfied, the smile of a man who had just said something clever and knew it, and knew that no one who mattered would contradict him. Ancilla mensa non intelligit. The table girl doesn't understand. Zoey was standing 2 feet from the table, reaching for the bread plate. Her hand paused for exactly 1 moment. Not noticeably, not to them, just the hairline pause of a mind registering information and deciding what to do with it. Then she continued clearing. She thought about 4 things simultaneously, which was a habit she'd developed in seminar rooms and had never unlearned: the literal translation, the implication, the rhetorical mode. Pure contempt dressed as observation, classic Juvenalian deployment of Latin as a marker of superiority. And the fact that Clifton Bauer had chosen the wrong case ending on mensa, which should have carried a different construction given what he was actually trying to say. She did not say any of this. She placed the bread plate on her tray. "Will you be having dessert this evening?" she asked. Warm, professional, perfect. "I think we will," said the woman in champagne, and her voice had a peculiar quality that Zoey couldn't quite locate until she looked up and saw that the woman, her nameplate, on the reservation, read Constance, was watching her with something that was not quite an apology and not quite respect, and was precisely the uncomfortable midpoint between them. Zoey brought the dessert menus. She went to the back. She stood at the service station for a long moment and looked at nothing. Around her the restaurant continued its quiet symphony, the clink of cutlery, the low current of conversation, the sound of a sommelier presenting a label to a table near the window. Phil appeared at her elbow with a question about a ticket. She answered it. He left. She thought about the first time her professor, Dr. Halcourt, a small woman in her 60s who wore the same brown cardigan every Monday and who had the sharpest mind Zoey had ever been in the presence of, had assigned her to translate a passage from Cicero's Pro Archia on the value of literature to the life of the mind. She had worked on it for 2 days. When she'd presented her translation in seminar, Dr. Halcourt had looked up from the page and said, without inflection, "This is the work of someone who understands what the Latin is actually feeling." Zoey had carried that sentence in her chest like a small coal for 3 years. She thought about her mother that morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her tea, asking whether Zoey had slept enough, as though she were still in some position to worry about Zoey's sleeping habits, as though it weren't Zoey who'd been up at 2 a.m., counting pills into a Tuesday container and reading the side effects of a new prescription on her phone screen in the dark. She thought about the fact that Clifton Bauer had mispronounced Ancilla when he'd said it. A small error, barely audible, but there. She brought the dessert courses out. The table had shifted into the quieter territory of the evening's end. Marcus was checking his phone under the table with the practiced subtlety of someone who's been doing it all dinner. The 4th man, who she'd learned, was named James Corey. Investor, according to the reservation notes, affiliated with a firm she recognized from the news coverage of 2 education non-profits that had ceased operating when their funding evaporated, had barely touched his dessert and was watching the room with an expression she couldn't easily categorize. Clifton Bauer was in the middle of a sentence about a legal dispute involving a former employee when he flagged her down with 2 fingers. "Yes," she said, "this isn't what I ordered." He gestured at his plate. "I asked for the soufflé. This is something else." She looked at the plate. It was the dark chocolate soufflé. It was exactly what he'd ordered. She could see the ticket in her mind's eye as clearly as if she were still holding it. The dark chocolate soufflé with the salted caramel crème anglaise, she said. That's what's listed. I wanted the vanilla. There was no vanilla soufflé on the menu. There was a vanilla bean panna cotta. She said, gently, that she'd be happy to bring him the panna cotta instead, that it was equally excellent, that she apologized for any. I know what I ordered, he said. His voice had not risen. This was the precise, particular cruelty of it. It hadn't needed to. The temperature at the table dropped 3 degrees. Constance set down her spoon. Marcus looked at his phone. James Corey looked at Clifton Bauer, then at Zoey, and something happened in his expression, the faintest recalibration, like a needle finding north. I'll speak with the kitchen, Zoey said. Please give me a moment. She walked to the back. She did not go to the kitchen. She stood in the service corridor, the cold white light above her humming quietly, and she pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum once, firmly, a gesture she'd developed as shorthand, for this is not your emergency. Then she did something she had never done in 3 years at Aurelius. She went back out to table 9, stood at the edge of it in the exact posture she had been trained to hold, shoulders back, weight-even hands quiet at her sides, and looked at Clifton Bauer. Mr. Bauer, she said, I've reviewed what's on the menu this evening, and I want to make sure I can help you find something you'll enjoy. But I want to be accurate with you. The vanilla soufflé isn't something we offer tonight. The dark chocolate that's in front of you is exactly what was ordered, and I want to be straightforward with you about that, because I think you'd want me to be. The table went very still. It was not confrontational. Her voice was level. Her face was open. She was not being aggressive or reckless. She was simply being clear, factual, precise. Clifton Bauer looked at her for a long time. Then he said, in the same tone he'd used all evening for the furniture assessment look, Meretrix insolenta loquitur. The insolent servant speaks above herself. Again, the Latin. Again, the assumption. The foundational load-bearing assumption of the entire evening. That she was decoration. That the words were a private room she couldn't enter. Zoey held his gaze. She felt something she could not entirely name. Not anger, or not only anger, but something older and cleaner. The particular clarity that arrives when a person has nothing left to perform. Sed erat in casu, she said. Her voice was quiet, conversational, the same tone she used when reciting specials. Et in sensu, ancilla mensae service. But you're wrong in the case, and in the meaning. A servant of the table serves. It took approximately 2 seconds for the sentence to land. The silence at table 9 was total and sudden. The way silence gets when a sound everyone was expecting simply doesn't happen. Clifton Bauer's expression passed through 3 distinct phases in rapid succession. Incomprehension, recalibration, and then something thin and fragile she had only ever seen once before, on a face like the face of her undergraduate academic advisor, when she'd corrected a citation error in front of a lecture hall of 200 students. Exposure. Constance made a sound that was not quite a laugh and turned it into a cough. Marcus had stopped looking at his phone. James Corey was watching Zoey with the focused stillness of a person suddenly paying very close attention. You. Clifton Bauer started. The dark chocolate soufflé is genuinely excellent, Zoey said, as if nothing had happened, as if they were simply still talking about dessert, as if the last 30 seconds occupied a different room entirely. I'd recommend finishing it while it's warm. The center sets quickly. She looked around the table with a professional smile. Can I bring anyone coffee? Constance said yes. Marcus said yes. The 4th man, James Corey, looked at Zoey with an expression she couldn't read and said he'd like to know the name of the restaurant's wine program director. if that wasn't too much trouble. It wasn't, she told him. She brought the coffee. Clifton Bauer did not finish his soufflé. He did not say another word to her for the remainder of the evening. He signed the check, a number, given the wine, that would have covered her mother's pharmacy bills for 6 weeks, and added a tip that was exactly 11%, which was almost certainly intentional, a last small assertion of territory. The others left without ceremony. James Corey was the last to go. He stopped at the coat check, turned back and said, "Excuse me, Zoey." She came over from the server station. "I'm sorry about this evening," he said. That was. He paused, and she could see him choosing between several available sentences, the particular deliberateness of someone who speaks carefully because they've learned that words are structural. That was not appropriate. "I appreciate you saying that. I wanted to ask." He stopped. Started again. "Your Latin. Where did you study?" She looked at him. He was perhaps 50, silver at the temples, the understated suit of someone who had stopped needing to signal authority through fabric. His eyes were the kind that moved quickly and landed precisely. "Columbia," she said. "Graduate linguistics. I'm on leave." Something shifted in his face. "What's your research?" "Classical rhetorical structures and their persistence in contemporary political speech." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm on the advisory board of the Haverford Institute for Rhetoric and Public Language. We've been looking for a research fellow for 6 months." He reached into his jacket and produced a card. The action so economical it didn't look like networking, just information exchange, one mind recognizing another. "I'd like you to send me your thesis proposal, if you're willing." She took the card. James Corey, Executive Director, the Haverford Institute. She thought about her mother at the kitchen table with her tea. She thought about the pharmacy bills in the Tuesday container. She thought about Dr. Halcourt and the brown cardigan, and someone who understands what the Latin is actually feeling. "I'll send it tomorrow," she said. He nodded once and left. She stood for a moment in the entry of Aurelius, the card between her fingers, the restaurant behind her, settling into the quiet end-of-service sounds she knew by heart. The muted clatter of the kitchen breaking down, the distant low conversation of the sommelier closing out his cellar book, Phil stacking bread plates in even, unhurried columns the way he always did, the same way he'd been doing it for 11 years. She slipped the card into the pocket of her apron, next to the wine key. That night, after the service, she sat at the kitchen table in Morningside Heights while her mother slept, and she opened her laptop. The thesis proposal was in a folder she hadn't opened in 8 months. She read it through once, slowly, the way she'd learned to read Latin, not word by word, but as a whole thing, for what it was actually feeling. It was good. It was still good. She had not misremembered that. She read it again. Then she opened a new email. 3 weeks later, she got the call from the Haverford Institute. The fellowship was 2 years, fully funded, with health benefits that would cover a dependent. The office was in Midtown, 12 minutes from Aurelius by subway. She could, if she chose, keep her shifts on weekends for the first month while she transitioned, or she could not. It was entirely her decision. She gave 2 weeks' notice on a Tuesday. Her manager, a precise woman named Celia, who had never once in 3 years commented on anything except the quality of the table aside presentation, looked at the letter and then at Zoey, and said, with the flatness of genuine surprise, "You're going back to academia. Research fellowship," Zoey said. Celia nodded slowly. Then, in what was for her an extraordinary departure, "Good." On her last night at Aurelius, Phil appeared at her elbow at the end of service with 2 cups of coffee, a thing she had never once seen him do for anyone, and set one in front of her without a word. They stood in the service corridor for a few minutes and drank them. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. It was enough. She thought, later, that the thing about Clifton Bauer was not that he had been wrong about her, though he had been, comprehensively and in multiple languages. The thing was that his wrongness had been so complete, so perfectly sealed against the possibility of evidence, that it had required Latin to open it. Not because she had needed to prove anything to him. She hadn't, and she'd understood that, even in the moment, but because some doors are only opened from the inside, by the person who has been pressing against them for years with no one watching, and it is not always dramatic when they finally give. Sometimes it is simply quiet. A sentence. A card passed between two people in an entryway. A folder reopened at a kitchen table at midnight. She walked out of Aurelius for the last time on a Friday evening in October, when the city had finally remembered to be cold and the sidewalks held that particular amber light that only happens when the sun is low and the ginkgo trees are turning all at once. She stood outside for a moment. The city moved around her with the same absolute indifference it always had. Taxis, conversation fragments, the particular smell of autumn and exhaust and the underground. She put in her earbuds. She walked north. Behind her, the door of Aurelius opened and closed for someone else, and the evening continued, as evenings do, regardless.